Washington, D.C., 1943. A Pentagon conference room. The attendees were impressive. Admirals, generals, scientists from the Office of Scientific Research and Development, engineers from major defense contractors. These were serious men addressing serious problems. America's guided missile program was struggling. Electronic guidance systems were primitive, unreliable, expensive. The accuracy was poor. The military needed better solutions. The next presenter walked to the front of the room. Dr. Burris Frederick Skinner, B.F. Skinner, Harvard's most prominent behavioral psychologist, pioneer of operant conditioning, one of the 20th century's most respected scientists. His research on animal behavior had revolutionized psychology. His books were required reading in universities worldwide. When Skinner spoke about behavioral science, people listened. Skinner began his presentation. America's guided missiles needed better targeting systems. Electronic systems were unreliable. Visual recognition was key to accuracy. What if we used biological systems instead of electronic ones? What if we trained animals to recognize targets and control missile guidance? The military officers leaned forward with interest. This was unconventional thinking, but Skinner's reputation commanded attention. What animals did he propose? Dogs? Primates? What biological system could possibly guide a missile? Skinner clicked to his next slide. Pigeons. 3 pigeons per missile. Placed in the nose cone. Trained to peck at projected images of enemy ships. Their pecks would control the missile's flight surfaces through mechanical linkages. A majority vote system. If 2 of 3 pigeons pecked left, the missile turned left. If 2 pecked right, it turned right. If all 3 pecked center, the missile flew straight. The room fell into stunned silence. One admiral finally spoke. "You want us to put pigeons in missiles?" Skinner was prepared for skepticism. He'd anticipated it. Yes, pigeons. And he could demonstrate the system worked. He'd already conducted preliminary testing. Pigeons could be trained to recognize ship silhouettes with remarkable accuracy. They pecked consistently and reliably at target images. Tests showed 80% accuracy, better than America's early electronic guidance systems. The concept wasn't theoretical. It was functional. Skinner had built prototypes, trained pigeons, demonstrated the guidance mechanism. This wasn't a proposal for research. It was a proposal to deploy a working system. The military brass exchanged glances. The idea was absurd. Pigeons steering missiles. It sounded like a joke, a parody of scientific research. How could they take this seriously? But Skinner wasn't joking. He was completely serious, and his credentials were impeccable. This was Harvard's most famous psychologist, a scientist whose work was changing fundamental understanding of behavior and learning. If he said pigeons could guide missiles, maybe they could. This is the story of Project Pigeon, one of World War II's most bizarre weapons programs. A system that actually worked, but was too strange for military leadership to accept. A program that demonstrated biological systems could outperform early electronics. And a fascinating glimpse into how desperate wartime research explored every possible avenue, no matter how unconventional. The story begins not in 1943, but several years earlier, with Skinner's groundbreaking research into animal behavior and learning. B.F. Skinner had revolutionized psychology through his work on operant conditioning. The principle was simple but powerful. Animals, including humans, learn behaviors through consequences. Behaviors followed by positive consequences are reinforced and repeated. Behaviors followed by negative consequences are reduced. Skinner demonstrated this with remarkable precision, using what became known as the Skinner box, an experimental apparatus where animals learned to perform specific actions to receive food rewards. Pigeons learned to peck colored discs. Rats learned to press levers. The learning was systematic, predictable, controllable. But Skinner discovered something more profound. Animals could learn remarkably complex behaviors through careful training. They could discriminate between similar images. They could learn sequences of actions. They could perform tasks with consistency and accuracy that rivaled or exceeded mechanical systems. Pigeons, Skinner found, had exceptional visual discrimination abilities. They could learn to distinguish between different shapes, colors, patterns. Once trained, they performed consistently. Their behavior was reliable, predictable, controllable through properly structured rewards. In December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, Skinner began thinking about military applications of his research. America was at war. Scientists were being mobilized to develop weapons. Skinner's expertise was animal behavior. Could behavioral science contribute to the war effort? Skinner identified a critical military problem: guided missile accuracy. Early guided missiles existed, but guidance systems were primitive. Radio control could be jammed. Early electronic systems were unreliable and expensive. Visual recognition, identifying targets and steering toward them, was difficult to automate with available technology. But pigeons had excellent visual recognition. They could be trained to identify specific targets. They responded quickly and consistently. What if pigeons could be used as biological guidance systems? The idea seemed absurd even to Skinner initially. Pigeons steering missiles toward enemy ships? It sounded like science fiction or comedy. But as Skinner thought through the mechanics, it became less absurd and more feasible. Pigeons could be trained to peck at images of ships. The pecking could control mechanical linkages connected to the missile's control surfaces. Multiple pigeons could provide redundancy. If one failed or was confused, the others would maintain guidance. The system would be self-correcting through the majority vote mechanism. Skinner began preliminary experiments in his Harvard laboratory. He trained pigeons to recognize and peck at photographs of different ship types. The birds learned quickly. They could distinguish between friendly and enemy vessels, between different classes of ships. They pecked consistently at target images. The accuracy was remarkable. Once trained, pigeons correctly identified and pecked at target images over 80% of the time. This was better than many early electronic guidance systems, and pigeons didn't require complex electronics that could fail or be jammed. Encouraged by initial results, Skinner prepared a formal proposal for military funding. He called it Project Pigeon. The proposal outlined the concept, described the training methodology, presented preliminary test results, and estimated costs. $25,000 would fund full development and testing. In 1940, Skinner submitted the proposal to the National Defense Research Committee. The response was skeptical but intrigued. The NDRC funded the project, though clearly with reservations. The approval letter reportedly included comments suggesting this was the strangest proposal they'd received. Skinner assembled a small team. He needed engineers to design the nose cone apparatus, trainers to work with pigeons, technicians to build prototypes. The work was conducted at General Mills in Minneapolis. The food company had offered facilities for unconventional war research. Yes, General Mills, the company that made breakfast cereal. They had research facilities, engineers, and space. And nobody would suspect that missile guidance research was happening at a cereal company. Security through obscurity. The technical challenges were significant, but solvable. The nose cone needed to house 3 pigeons in separate compartments. Each pigeon faced a small screen showing the view ahead, projected through a lens system. When the pigeon pecked at the screen, its pecks registered on a touch-sensitive surface. The pecking pattern, left, right, or center, controlled servo mechanisms connected to the missile's control surfaces. The training program was elaborate. Pigeons were first trained to peck at stationary images of ships for food rewards, then moving images, then images from different angles and distances, then images with varying backgrounds and lighting conditions. The training increased in complexity until pigeons could reliably recognize target ships under diverse conditions. Skinner used principles of operant conditioning with precision. Food rewards were delivered immediately after correct pecking. Incorrect pecking received no reward. The timing and consistency of reinforcement were critical. Pigeons learned remarkably quickly when the training protocol was properly structured. Within weeks, trained pigeons demonstrated consistent target recognition. They pecked at enemy ship images reliably. They ignored friendly ships and background scenery. They maintained focus even when the image moved or changed perspective. The mechanical system worked smoothly. The servo mechanisms responded to pecking patterns. The control surfaces moved appropriately. The entire guidance loop, from target image to pigeon perception to pecking to mechanical response, functioned reliably. By 1943, Skinner was ready to demonstrate the system to military leadership. Hence, the Pentagon presentation. He brought trained pigeons. He brought prototype equipment. He demonstrated the entire process. The demonstration was successful from a technical standpoint. The pigeons performed as advertised. They recognized target images. They pecked consistently. The guidance mechanism responded correctly. Everything worked. But the military response was deeply skeptical. Yes, it worked in the laboratory. But could it work in combat? Pigeons in missiles flying at hundreds of miles per hour? Subjected to acceleration, vibration, noise? Would the pigeons panic? Would they freeze? Would they become disoriented? And then there was the fundamental absurdity. Pigeons. Steering missiles. It was too bizarre. How could military leadership justify deploying pigeon-guided weapons? How would they explain it to Congress? To the public? To the troops? One general reportedly asked, "What happens if the pigeons get distracted? What if they see another bird and peck at that instead of the target?" Skinner explained that trained pigeons maintained focus on the target image. The training was robust. Pigeons had proven reliable under testing. But the skepticism remained. Despite reservations, the military authorized continued development. Project Pigeon received additional funding. The team expanded. More sophisticated prototypes were built. Testing continued. The engineering challenges were substantial. The nose cone needed to protect pigeons from acceleration forces while allowing clear view of the target. Temperature had to be controlled. Pigeons couldn't function if too cold or hot. The optical system had to project a clear image while the missile was moving at high speed. The mechanical linkages had to be robust enough to control flight surfaces, yet sensitive enough to respond to pigeon pecking. Skinner's team solved these problems systematically. They designed reinforced compartments that protected pigeons from acceleration while providing clear forward view. They developed heating systems to maintain appropriate temperature. They refined the optical projection system. They engineered precise mechanical linkages. Testing expanded from stationary apparatus to moving platforms. Pigeons were tested in devices that simulated missile flight, acceleration, vibration, rotation. The birds adapted remarkably well. They continued pecking at targets even under conditions that seemed likely to confuse or panic them. Skinner conducted tests with multiple pigeons simultaneously, verifying that the majority vote system worked. 3 pigeons viewing the same target image pecked in coordinated patterns. When all 3 identified the same target, their pecks aligned. The guidance corrections were smooth and accurate. The system's accuracy in testing exceeded 80%. Pigeons correctly identified and tracked target images more than 4 times out of 5. This compared favorably to early radar guidance systems, which were less accurate and more expensive. But as testing progressed, a parallel development undermined Project Pigeon's future. Electronic guidance systems were improving. Radar technology advanced rapidly. Proximity fuses were developed. The electronic systems that had been primitive and unreliable in 1940 became increasingly sophisticated by 1943 and 1944. The military's interest in pigeon guidance waned, not because it didn't work, it worked well, but because electronic alternatives were becoming viable. And electronic systems didn't create the psychological barrier that pigeon guidance did. In October 1944, Project Pigeon was officially cancelled. The stated reason was that electronic guidance had advanced sufficiently to meet military needs. The real reason was probably that military leadership never fully accepted the concept of pigeons steering missiles. It was too unconventional, too bizarre, too difficult to justify. Skinner was frustrated, but not entirely surprised. He'd recognized from the beginning that the psychological barrier might be insurmountable. Military culture valued technological sophistication. Pigeons weren't sophisticated. They were birds. The fact that they worked better than early electronics didn't overcome the fundamental weirdness of the concept. The project's cancellation might have been the end of the story, but in 1948, with the Cold War intensifying and guided missile development accelerating, the Navy reconsidered. Electronic guidance still had limitations. Maybe biological guidance deserved another look. Project Pigeon was revived as Project Orcon, organic control. The concept was similar, but the technology more advanced. Better nose cones, more sophisticated optics, improved training protocols. The Navy invested in developing an operational system. Testing resumed. Pigeons were trained on new equipment. Simulations became more realistic. The accuracy remained high, over 80%. The system functioned reliably. But ultimately, Project Orcon met the same fate as Project Pigeon. Electronic guidance continued improving. By the early 1950s, radar and infrared guidance systems were reliable and accurate. The need for biological guidance had passed. In 1953, Project Orcon was permanently terminated. The equipment was dismantled. The pigeons were retired to coops. The research files were classified and archived. For nearly 40 years, Project Pigeon and Project Orcon remained secret military programs that almost nobody knew about. In the 1990s, as Cold War documents were declassified, information about pigeon-guided missiles began emerging. Skinner himself had written about the project after it was declassified. His account, published in American Psychologist, described the program with mixture of pride in its technical success and frustration at its rejection. The public reaction to learning about pigeon-guided missiles was predictable. Amusement, disbelief, comments about government waste. The idea seemed ridiculous in retrospect. But from scientific and engineering perspectives, Project Pigeon was remarkable. It demonstrated that biological systems could outperform early electronic systems for certain tasks. It showed that animal behavior could be controlled and utilized with precision. It proved that unconventional approaches could solve difficult technical problems. Skinner argued that Project Pigeon's rejection represented a failure of imagination by military leadership. The system worked. It was reliable. It was accurate. It could have been deployed. The only barrier was psychological, the inability to accept that pigeons could be effective guidance systems. Some military historians agree. In the early war years, when electronic guidance was primitive, pigeon guidance might have improved missile accuracy significantly. American missiles in 1943 were notoriously inaccurate. If pigeon guidance had been deployed, it might have altered combat outcomes. Others argue that the military made the right decision. Electronic guidance had greater long-term potential. Investing in electronics rather than pigeons positioned America for future guidance system development. Pigeon guidance was a dead-end technology. Even if it worked, it had no development path forward. Both perspectives have merit. Project Pigeon worked within its specific context, but offered no path to improvement. Electronic guidance, though initially inferior, could be improved continuously as electronics advanced. Pigeons couldn't be upgraded. The ethical dimension of Project Pigeon is also worth considering. The program essentially weaponized animals. Pigeons would have been placed in missiles and killed on impact. They wouldn't have understood their role or had any choice in participation. Skinner addressed this in his writings. He acknowledged the ethical concerns but noted that animals were already being used in war. Horses, dogs, even cats in some cases. Pigeons guiding missiles weren't fundamentally different from dogs detecting mines or horses carrying soldiers. War involved using all available resources, including animals. Modern perspectives on animal use in warfare are more critical. Many ethicists argue that animals shouldn't be weaponized regardless of military necessity. They can't consent. They can't understand the purpose. Using them as guidance systems treats them as expendable tools rather than sentient beings. But in the 1940s, these ethical considerations were less prominent. The focus was on winning the war using any effective means. If pigeons could guide missiles accurately, that was sufficient justification. The scientific legacy of Project Pigeon extends beyond the specific application. The research advanced understanding of visual discrimination in animals. It demonstrated practical applications of operant conditioning. It showed that biological systems could perform complex, purposeful behaviors reliably. Skinner's work on Project Pigeon contributed to his broader theoretical framework about behavior, learning, and control. His later work on teaching machines, behavior modification, and programmed learning drew on insights developed during the pigeon guidance research. The project also influenced military thinking about unconventional weapon systems. The fact that pigeons nearly became operational guidance systems opened minds to other non-traditional approaches. The bat bombs, dolphin surveillance programs, and other animal-based military systems all followed in Project Pigeon's wake. Modern precision weapons validate some of Skinner's core insights. Visual target recognition is critical to guidance accuracy. Modern missiles use cameras and pattern recognition, essentially doing electronically what Skinner proposed doing biologically. The pigeon's ability to recognize ship silhouettes anticipated modern computer vision systems. If you explained modern cruise missile guidance to Skinner, he'd recognize the parallel immediately. A camera captures target image. Software analyzes the image, identifies the target, calculates corrections, adjusts control surfaces. Replace software with trained pigeons, and you have Project Pigeon. The difference is scale and flexibility. Software can be updated, improved, customized for different targets. Pigeons, once trained, were specialized for specific target types. Retraining for new targets took time. Software changes are instant. But in the early 1940s, software didn't exist in any meaningful sense. Computers were room-sized machines that couldn't fit in missiles. The choice wasn't between pigeons and software. It was between pigeons and crude analog electronics. In that comparison, pigeons were competitive. So why didn't pigeon guidance succeed? The technical explanation is that electronics advanced faster than expected, making biological guidance obsolete before it could be deployed. But the deeper explanation is psychological and cultural. Military culture values technology, sophistication, advancement. Pigeons, no matter how well they performed, represented a step backward conceptually. Using birds to guide missiles seemed primitive. It felt like retreating to biology when the future was clearly technological. This cultural bias against biological solutions persists today. When modern engineers encounter technical challenges, they reflexively seek technological solutions, better sensors, faster processors, more sophisticated algorithms. They rarely consider whether biological systems might perform better. Yet biological systems still outperform technology in many domains. Human vision exceeds computer vision for many tasks. Biological olfaction, smell, far exceeds electronic sensors. Animal navigation systems function in conditions where GPS fails. Project Pigeon asked whether biological capabilities could be harnessed for military purposes. The answer was yes, they could. But military culture ultimately rejected the approach, preferring to wait for technology to catch up rather than deploy biological solutions. There's a broader lesson here about innovation and acceptance. Technical merit isn't sufficient for adoption. Social acceptance, cultural fit, psychological comfort all matter. Project Pigeon failed not because it didn't work, but because it was too weird. Skinner recognized this. In later writings, he acknowledged that the project's strangest aspect wasn't the technical challenges, but the psychological ones. Convincing pigeons to peck at targets was easier than convincing generals to deploy pigeons in missiles. The historical irony is that more destructive and bizarre weapons were developed and deployed. Bat bombs, another animal-based weapon system, came close to deployment. Napalm, which burned people alive, was used extensively. Atomic bombs killed hundreds of thousands. Yet pigeon-guided missiles were too strange to accept. Perhaps it was the disconnect between appearance and lethality. Pigeons seem harmless, cute even. Using them to guide deadly weapons created cognitive dissonance. Other weapons looked threatening, felt appropriate to warfare. Pigeons didn't fit the aesthetic of modern military technology. Whatever the reasons, Project Pigeon remained a classified footnote until the 1990s. When information was finally released, it became instant legend. The story of pigeon-guided missiles captured public imagination precisely because it seemed so absurd, yet was completely real. The internet embraced the story. Memes proliferated. Jokes about government waste and strange military projects. Lists of bizarre military programs always included Project Pigeon. The program became symbol of wartime desperation and scientific creativity. But beneath the humor lies a serious story about innovation, behavior science, and the challenges of getting unconventional ideas accepted. Skinner developed a working system that solved real military problems. It was rejected not for technical inadequacy, but for psychological incompatibility with military culture. Today, several institutions preserve Project Pigeon artifacts. The Smithsonian has prototype nose cones and training equipment. Harvard archives contain Skinner's research notes and correspondence. The National Archives hold classified project files, now declassified and available to researchers. Skinner himself never stopped believing the project should have been deployed. Until his death in 1990, he maintained that pigeon guidance would have worked in combat. The technical challenges had been solved. The accuracy was proven. Military conservatism and technological bias prevented an effective system from being used. Whether he was right is impossible to know definitively. We can't rerun history with pigeon-guided missiles deployed. We can only speculate about whether they would have improved American missile accuracy in 1943 and 44. What we know for certain is that Project Pigeon worked in testing. Pigeons could guide missiles, they could recognize targets, they performed with 80% accuracy. The system was functional, reliable, and cheaper than electronic alternatives available at the time. We also know that military leadership chose to wait for electronic guidance to improve, rather than deploy biological guidance. This decision made sense from certain perspectives. Electronics had greater long-term potential, but it also reflected cultural bias against biological solutions to technical problems. The story of Project Pigeon is ultimately about the relationship between science and military culture, about how innovation happens and what barriers prevent adoption of effective but unconventional solutions, about the gap between technical feasibility and social acceptance. B.F. Skinner trained pigeons to guide missiles toward enemy ships with 80% accuracy. The Japanese Navy never knew that American pigeons were being prepared to attack them. Not because the program was so secret, though it was classified, but because it was never deployed. The pigeons were ready. The technology worked. The accuracy was proven. But the admirals couldn't bring themselves to order pigeon-guided missiles into combat. It was too strange, too unconventional, too far outside military tradition. So the pigeons retired to coops. The nose cones were stored in warehouses. The project was classified and forgotten, until decades later, when declassified documents revealed one of World War II's most fascinating might-have-beens. A weapon that worked but seemed too bizarre to use. Pigeons trained to guide missiles. 80% accuracy. Better than early electronics. Never deployed because military leadership couldn't overcome the fundamental weirdness of the concept. The Japanese ships never knew how close they came to being attacked by pigeons. 80% accuracy. Better than early radar guidance. Cheaper than electronic systems. Faster to develop than advanced electronics. And completely unacceptable to military leadership because it involved pigeons. Project Pigeon worked. That's what makes this story so fascinating. This wasn't a failed experiment. It wasn't a proposal that couldn't be executed. It was a functional system that solved real military problems and was rejected because it was too weird. B.F. Skinner, Harvard's most prominent psychologist, one of the 20th century's most influential behavioral scientists, spent years training pigeons to recognize and track enemy ships. He solved the technical challenges. He demonstrated the system. He proved it worked. The military said, "We can't ask Congress to fund pigeon-guided missiles." And that was that. The technical success didn't matter. The accuracy didn't matter. The cost advantage didn't matter. The psychological barrier was insurmountable. Meanwhile, bat bombs, literally bats carrying incendiary devices, nearly reached deployment. Somehow, weaponizing bats was acceptable, but training pigeons to peck at targets wasn't. The lesson isn't about pigeons or missiles, it's about innovation and acceptance. About how the best technical solution doesn't always win. About how cultural fit and psychological comfort matter as much as performance. Skinner proved that biological systems could outperform early electronics. He was decades ahead of his time in recognizing that visual pattern recognition was key to guidance accuracy. Modern cruise missiles do electronically what he proposed doing biologically. But in 1943, putting pigeons in missiles was too strange. So the project was shelved. And the Japanese ships never knew how close they came to being attacked by birds. If this story fascinated you, the bizarre weapons, the unconventional thinking, the systems that almost changed warfare, but were too strange to deploy, then you need to subscribe. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. War Rewind uncovers the strangest, most fascinating stories from World War II. The weapons that almost were. The programs that seemed insane but actually worked. The innovations that were too weird to accept.